It was a cold Thursday morning in late February when my phone rang before sunrise and the screen lit up with Hank's name. He had been in and out of the hospital for weeks, but he never called me that early. His voice was thin but urgent. He asked if I could come by the room before the doctors made their rounds. I dressed without thinking, drove through a city still shaking off sleep, and parked in the visitor lot with my heart already climbing my throat. The hallway smelled of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee. Hank was sitting up in bed with a blanket over his knees and a notebook on the tray table. He smiled when he saw me, but it was the kind of smile that asks you to sit down before you hear what's next. I set my thermos on the chair arm and asked if he wanted to play cards or read the newspaper. He shook his head slowly. He said, "Joe, I need to tell you something before I run out of time." His voice cracked on the last word like ice on a pond. He asked the nurse for privacy, and she closed the door softly behind her. The room went quiet except for the beep of the monitor and the rattle of the air vent. Hank looked at me with eyes that had once scanned mirrors for kids on icy mornings and now seemed to measure my soul. He said, "I have a son Lucy doesn't know about. He's mine. He was conceived when we were married. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I tried to fix it by keeping him at a distance, by sending money quietly, by setting up a small account in his name at the bank. I told myself I would come clean when the time was right, but it never was. Now I'm running out of time." My mouth went dry. I had known Hank for 30 years and thought I knew every story. My first instinct was to ask if he was sure, but the look on his face stopped me. He went on. "I don't want Lucy blindsided at the funeral. I don't want my boy erased. I also don't want Lucy humiliated. I'm asking you to keep this quiet until you can help it come out gently. There's a sealed letter at the bank with instructions. I've named him as beneficiary. I've told the manager to release it on my death. I've left Lucy enough in the household accounts to be secure. But this other thing, it's a tangle. I don't know how to die with it untangled." He reached for my hand. "Promise me you'll stand next to her. Promise me you'll not tell her outright, but you'll make sure she finds the truth in a way that doesn't destroy her." I stared at the man who had covered my shifts when my mother was dying, who had once pulled a kid from under a bus tire by the hood of his jacket, who had driven me home through a blizzard without asking why I had no gas in my car. My throat ached. I wanted to say no because I hated secrets, but the tubes at his arm and the tremor in his fingers made me see how cornered he felt. I said, "Hank, this is going to blow up. She's going to ask me, 'What do you want me to say?'" He whispered, "Say nothing until you can say it kindly. Or say nothing at all and just steer her to the bank. Please." The monitor beeped. The rain tapped the window like a metronome for our conversation. I heard myself say, "I promise." The words felt like a stone sinking into deep water. Hank closed his eyes briefly and nodded. He said, "Thank you, Joe. You were the best friend I ever had." When I walked out into the hallway, the walls seemed to lean in. I leaned against the vending machine and pressed my forehead to the cold glass because the story inside me was too hot to hold. In the elevator mirror, I barely recognized my own face. I drove home on autopilot through wet streets, parked in my driveway, and sat with the engine off for 10 minutes listening to the rain. The promise sat beside me like a third passenger. Hank died on a Sunday just after dawn when the hospital windows looked like pale coins and the birds were louder than the traffic. I stood next to Lucy while the nurse checked a screen that had already made up its mind. The nurse was kind in the way people learn to be when kindness is their only tool. She said, "Take your time," and closed the door. Lucy's fingers tightened around the bedsheet the way you grip a rail on a ferry in choppy water. I poured the last of my thermos into a paper cup and set it beside her hand because grief dries the throat first. She nodded without drinking and said thank you the way people say it when words are a coat they still know how to put on. The weak move like furniture you have to carry even when your back aches. I called the church and the union hall and the old route supervisor who still keeps the list. I wrote the eulogy on a yellow pad with a blunt pencil because pens felt too smooth for the truth. At the service I said the things you can say in front of flowers and children, that Hank could fix most problems with a socket wrench and a story, That he taught me how to brake before the hill not on it, that he saved mittens in January and jokes for the last stop in June. People laughed where they were allowed and cried where they could not help it. After the burial, the church basement filled with coffee and potato salad and the sound of forks trying to be brave. Lucy stood beside me like a person learning how to walk on a ship that has already left the dock. 3 days later, the practical part began. Death comes with a to-do list. I drove Lucy to the bank because the paperwork had to breathe the same air as the teller to count as real. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and carpet. A painting of a red barn pretended to understand interest rates. The manager, a woman with a steady voice and a habit of listening longer than most, led Lucy into a glass office and asked for identification and the death certificate and the letters naming her as executor. I sat in the lobby and stared at a brochure about CDs with flags on the cover and tried not to hear Hank asking me to stand next to her. After a while, Lucy came out with a folder and eyes that had done too much reading for one day. We drove home in the slow lane because the other lanes looked reckless. That night she called and asked if I could come by in the morning to help sort the envelopes that had begun breeding in the mailbox. I brought donuts like an apology I wasn't ready to deliver. We spread bank statements and utility bills and insurance notices across the dining table that had hosted every Thanksgiving since 1998. The overhead lamp made a bright circle like a stage where understudies finally go on. Lucy made 3 piles labeled Pay Now, Pay Later, and Keep because some habits refused to panic. We worked in the quiet way people do when the task is bigger than conversation. Then the moment arrived the way thunder arrives, not a surprise but still a shock. She set her pen down and looked straight at me. She said, "Joe, is there anything I should know before I make decisions I cannot unmake?" And my mouth found a shape before my heart did. I said, "I think you should ask the bank for a full printout of anything Hank had in his name alone and anything joint and anything with beneficiaries, and also whether there are any letters of instruction on file." She heard the care in my sentence and the weight behind it. She is not a foolish woman. She said, "Why would there be letters of instruction I haven't seen?" I said, "Sometimes people leave notes about small things, final details, tools they promised to a nephew or a donation they meant to make." I told the truth sideways because the front door was locked. She watched me like a teacher deciding whether to move the quiz to Friday. She said, "If there is something that would change what I choose, I want to know it before I sign my name to a mistake." I felt Hank's promise sit up in the room like a third person. I said, "If something exists, the bank will have it, and will know how to handle it cleanly." She exhaled through her nose the way you do when you are trying to cool a pot without moving it. She circled the words bank appointment on her pad and underlined them twice. When I left, I did not turn on the radio. I drove to the grocery store and parked under the one light that always buzzes. I practiced sentences out loud with no audience. "Lucy, your husband loved you and also failed you. Lucy, there is a son you do not know. Lucy, I promise to let the truth arrive dressed properly." Every sentence tasted like metal. I remembered Hank in the hospital asking me to steer, not yank. He said, "Pick the road, not the ditch." I decided the road was this: get Lucy and the bank in the same room with all the doors open and let the paper do what paper does. The next morning I called the manager and said Lucy needs a complete review, every account in his name and every beneficiary, and any sealed instructions. The manager paused just long enough to signal that she knows what words can weigh. She said of course and set an appointment for Monday at 10. I told Lucy I would drive and she said please. The weekend dragged its feet. Grief and suspense make unkind roommates. On Sunday after church, the fellowship hall smelled like ham and coffee and old hymnals. People called Lucy dear and pressed napkins into her hand as if salt can cure all wounds. I carried the folding chairs back to the closet and tried not to imagine the envelope with Hank's block letters waiting behind a desk drawer. Monday arrived like a summons. We walked into the bank together, and the doors breathed cool air on our faces. The manager met us with that steady voice and ushered us into the same glass office. She verified Lucy's identification again and typed for a long time while the screen lit her glasses. She printed pages and sorted them into stacks. She tapped one stack and said, "These are joint accounts that transfer immediately." She tapped another and said these are solely in Mr. Harper's name, and will move into the estate. She tapped a third and said these are closed items with no action needed. Lucy nodded in the way of people who understand categories better than chaos. Then came the hinge. The manager looked at a note on her screen, then reached into a small drawer in the desk and removed a key on a blue ribbon. She unlocked a shallow compartment and took out a sealed envelope addressed in Hank's unmistakable block letters. The room changed shape. She said we have a letter of instruction on file connected to a certificate of deposit that matured last year and was renewed. Procedure is to release such a letter to the executor upon receipt of the death certificate, which we have. Would you like to read it here or take it home? Lucy held the envelope like it might say her name aloud. She glanced at me and found my eyes steady because a friend sometimes lends his spine. She said, I will read it here. She opened the flap carefully because respect for paper is a kind of prayer. Her eyes moved left to right, and then slowed and then stopped, and then started again. Her mouth tightened and softened and then settled in a line that meant the world had tilted but not fallen. She handed the letter to the manager and said, please read it so you can tell me what needs to happen, and then she looked at me, not pleading, not accusing, just measuring the space between what she knew and what she suspected. The manager read in silence and then folded the letter and set it down as if it were warm. She said this letter directs the bank to transfer the funds from the CD upon Mr. Harper's death to a named beneficiary described as his son, and to notify the beneficiary by certified mail. There is contact information attached. The letter also asks that the transfer be handled discreetly to spare the family distress. The manager paused and said we follow the instructions on the account unless a court orders otherwise. Lucy's fingers found the edge of the desk. She said his son, and the room learned how to echo. She whispered the word again as if practice could make it less sharp. She asked how much money and the manager told her the figure, not small, not ruinous, a sum big enough to own a shadow. Lucy stared at the envelope and then at the parking lot through the glass and then at the wedding ring she had not taken off. She said I need to know if this was before me or during me. Her voice did not rise but the sentence climbed into the rafters. The manager said the letter does not say. She looked at me then because a friend's face can betray a history even when his mouth behaves. I felt Hank's promise tighten like a knot against my ribs. I said I do not know the dates, which was both true and cowardly. She studied me and then nodded once the way a teacher decides to postpone a quiz. The manager asked if Lucy wanted to proceed per the instruction. Lucy did something I did not expect. She said please initiate the transfer and send the notice and also send me a copy, and then she said I will need the beneficiary's address. The manager said we will provide what we are permitted to provide. Lucy thanked her with a politeness sharp enough to cut cloth. We walked out into the morning and the sky looked exactly like it had an hour earlier, which felt like an insult. At the car she leaned on the door and breathed with her eyes closed. She said, Joe, if you know anything you have not said, I need you to weigh your promise against my right to stand upright in my own life. The sentence was not anger. It was a request to be treated as a grown woman. I said I promised Hank I would help you find the truth without breaking you with it, and I am trying to keep both halves of that promise. She opened her eyes and let me see that the lighthouse was still on even if the sea was mean. She said then keep trying, but know that I will ask again. That night the house was quiet in the loud way houses are when the truth has taken its share. I walked my small rooms and let the creaks tell me what they always tell me, that wood remembers weight but forgives it. I poured coffee I did not need and set out a deck of cards I had no one to play with. I said Hank out loud once because saying a name can shrink a mountain to a hill you can climb. I decided the next step was not to speak but to prepare to speak. I would call the bank tomorrow and ask whether the notice had gone out. I would ask Lucy to sit with me when the certified letter came so she would not read it alone. I would not let the boy arrive in her mailbox like a stray dog. I would be ready to tell her the part one could no longer keep when she asked me with both hands open. 2 days after the bank meeting, Lucy called me again. Her voice had that brittle steadiness you hear when someone has rehearsed what they're about to say. She asked if I could come over because the certified letter had arrived. I drove through misty rain with the heater on low, hands gripping the wheel like a confessional. When I stepped into her kitchen, she was sitting at the table with the envelope already slit open but not yet read. She pushed it toward me and said, "I don't know if I can do this alone." We sat side by side while she unfolded the pages. The first sheet was a formal bank notification of transfer. The second was Hank's own handwriting on bank letterhead. He wrote that the funds in the certificate of deposit were to go to his son, named with an address, born in 1994, and that this son had been conceived during his marriage to Lucy. He wrote that he had lived with guilt for decades, that he had tried to support the boy quietly but never found the courage to tell the truth. He wrote that he loved Lucy, that his betrayal was a single night that became a lifetime of secrecy, and that his hope was for honesty to arrive after his death in a way that would not destroy the woman he had loved most. Lucy read the words once, then again, then folded the letter carefully and set it down like a hot pan. She didn't cry. She stared at the salt shaker as if it held an answer. She said softly, "During our marriage." She said it again, louder. She asked me if I knew. I said Hank told me in the hospital and asked me to help her find the truth without crushing her. She stood up so fast the chair tipped. She walked to the sink and gripped the edge until her knuckles went white. "All these years," she whispered. "And you knew for days and didn't tell me?" I said, "I promised him, but I also tried to steer you to the bank so you'd see it on paper, not in a rumor." The kitchen filled with the sound of the rain against the windows. Lucy turned around. Her face wasn't angry yet. It was raw. She said, "I don't know who I am in this marriage anymore." I said, "You are the same woman who loved him, who built a home with him, who deserves the truth and also deserves to decide what comes next." She slid down into the chair again and covered her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but clear. "I feel betrayed and relieved at the same time. Relieved that I'm not crazy for sensing something. Betrayed because he let me live a lie. I don't know if I hate him or miss him more right now." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "You're allowed to feel all of it," I said. "And you don't have to decide today what to do about the boy or the money." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "The boy," she said. "He's almost 30. He's not a boy." She looked at me. "What would you do, Joe?" I swallowed hard. "I'd start by breathing. Then I'd write him a letter, not about money but about truth. I'd tell him what you need to tell him, whatever that is. And I'd decide later if I wanted to meet him." She stared at the folded letter, then at the window. "I can't meet him yet," she said. "But I can't pretend he doesn't exist either." We spent the afternoon drafting a short note. She wrote that she had learned about him only now, that she was shocked but did not wish to punish him for his father's mistakes, that the funds were being transferred according to Hank's wishes, that she needed time but hoped to one day speak with him. She signed simply, sincerely, Lucy. When we sealed the envelope, she exhaled as if a heavy door had closed. She looked at me and said, "You kept your promise to Hank and you helped me find the truth. I'm angry at you, but I also thank you. Maybe that's what real friendship looks like." That evening we drove to the lake. The water was gray and still. We sat on the old dock without speaking until the heron flew low across the surface like a line under a sentence. Lucy finally said, "I thought I was protecting our marriage all these years. Turns out I was just living in a story I didn't write. But today at least I started a new one." She turned to me. "What you did wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was human." I felt something loosen inside me. I said, "Hank used to tell me a driver survives by picking the road, not the ditch. I tried to pick the road." Lucy nodded slowly. "And we're still on it," she said. The sun dipped behind the trees. For the first time since Hank's call that February morning, I felt a kind of quiet that wasn't just silence but release. I'll leave you with this question. If you were me, would you have kept Hank's secret to protect his dying wish, or told Lucy everything the moment she asked?